There's a kind of crying that crosses dimensions, that pierces the veil between the human and the divine, that makes even God waver. And it was precisely this kind of crying that echoed that suffocating afternoon in Nain, a small town forgotten on the map of Israel, where the dust clung to the skin and the sun beat down mercilessly. A woman walked. No, she dragged herself. Behind a funeral procession, behind a rough wooden box that carried the body of her only son, widowed, alone. And now, without the boy who was all that stood between her and the utter abyss, the scent of myrrh mixed with the sweat of the bearers, the low, uncomfortable murmur of people who attend funerals, not out of love, but out of social obligation, that kind of presence that is almost an absence. She wept, but it was no ordinary crying. It was the sound of someone who no longer has reason to feign composure, to maintain dignity, to protect their image. It was the raw cry of someone who lost everything and knew that life from then on would just be about surviving until they died for good. Think about it. Back then, a childless widow wasn't just poor. She was dead in life, without a man, without protection, without inheritance, without a voice, a burden to her relatives, an invisible number in the statistics of poverty. And this woman had already buried her husband years before. She had already felt the cold of loneliness, the bite of hunger, the silent contempt of her neighbors. But her son, her son was the only thing keeping her going, the only reason not to give up. And now he was there, wrapped in burial shrouds, rigid, colorless, without a future. The procession moved slowly, as all processions do. Heavy footsteps, heads lowered, the automatic ritual of death. No one really looked at her, no one saw her pain. They simply followed protocol. Attend, mourn, return home, forget. But she couldn't forget. She was being buried alongside her son, but no one would throw dirt over her body. And then something impossible happened. The procession stopped, not because it reached the cemetery, not because someone tripped, but because someone blocked the path. A group of men appeared in the opposite direction, and in their center, a man with a deep, intense gaze, as if he saw through everything. Jesus. He wasn't there by chance. He wasn't called. He wasn't invited. He simply appeared. And when his eyes met the eyes of that broken mother, the world slowed. The air grew thick, and something dangerous happened inside him. Something no one would expect. He was tempted, not by glory, not by power, but by compassion, by the unbearable pain of seeing that broken woman. And this, you'll understand, is the most dangerous temptation of all, because it doesn't come from evil, it comes from love. And loving out of time, loving outside of plan, can destroy everything. Jesus knew something no one else did at that moment. His every miracle had a purpose. Every healing, every wonder, was woven into a larger fabric that would lead to the cross, to death, to resurrection. Everything calculated, everything foreseen. But there, before that mother, the divine plan seemed cruel, cold, distant, and for the first time, perhaps, he felt the weight of being both human and God at the same time. The conflict between following the perfect script or giving in to the impulse to save a life that wasn't in the script. Was it worth breaking the plan for just one person? Can compassion sometimes be a mistake? These are not easy questions, and Jesus in that moment had to decide quickly, without consulting anyone, because the mother was there, falling apart, and the son was dead, and time waits. If you're enjoying this story and want to see how it ends, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell, because what comes next will leave you speechless. He approached the coffin. The crowd held their breath. Touching a coffin was impure, forbidden. You don't do that. But Jesus did. He placed his hand on the rough wood stained with dirt and sweat and stopped everything. The bearers froze, uncomprehending. The mother raised her red, swollen, still wet eyes, and then Jesus spoke, but not to her, to the dead man. "Young man, I say to you, arise." The silence that followed was deafening. Some laughed nervously, others frowned in disbelief, talking to a corpse. What madness was this? But the mother didn't laugh. She just stared, fixedly, into that coffin and waited. Because when you have nothing left, even the impossible becomes hope. And then a finger moved, a breath, a low moan, like someone waking from a nightmare too deep. The young man opened his eyes, slowly, confused, as if returning from a place without light, without sound, without time. He blinked, he looked around, and sat up, inside the coffin, alive. The mother couldn't move for a few seconds. Her brain short-circuited. The dead don't come back. Life doesn't give second chances. But there he was, breathing, looking at her. And then she ran. She stumbled, almost fell, but she ran, and she hugged him as if she wanted to fuse him back into her own body, as if she could protect him from death forever. And while she now wept over something unnameable, Jesus just watched, quietly, without smiling, without making a speech. He simply handed his son to his mother, like someone returning something stolen. But deep in his eyes, there was a shadow, a weight, because he knew something. No one else knew at that moment. That miracle would have a price, and that price would be exacted sooner than anyone imagined. But for now, in that suspended instant, all that mattered was a mother's embrace and a child's heart beating again. Leave a comment below. Do you think Jesus made the right choice in saving that young man? Or are there times when even compassion needs to wait for the right time? You need to understand who this woman was before everything fell apart, because the story you just saw doesn't begin at the funeral. It begins years before, when she still had a name people spoke with respect, when there was still food on the table and a man sleeping beside her. She was a wife, a mother, someone. But fate has a cruel way of slowly erasing people, layer by layer, until nothing remains but a shadow no one sees. First, they took her husband, a fever, quick, violent, without warning. She remembers his body growing cold as she held his hand, begging God for one more day, one more hour, one more second. But God didn't answer. And when they buried the man, they also buried her surname, her protection, her place in the world. Because in that society, a woman without a husband was nothing. She was a problem, a burden, one more mouth to feed. But there was still her son, the boy she rocked all night long, who cried in her arms, who learned to walk holding her fingers. He grew up too fast. He became a man before his time, because he had to. Someone had to work, bring bread, support the crumbling house. And he did. With his calloused hands, his shoulders hunched, his face aged by premature responsibility. He was all that stood between her and begging, between her and total invisibility. And she clung to him like someone clinging to a piece of driftwood in the middle of the ocean, not out of selfishness, for survival, because without him, she ceased to exist. Not metaphorically, literally. A childless widow in those days was cast to the margins of society, forgotten, ignored, dead before she died. And she knew it. She felt it every day in the eyes of her neighbors, in the silence of the synagogue, in the way people moved out of their way to avoid her. And then the illness came. We don't know the name. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it was quick. He was fine in the morning, complaining of a headache, and by nightfall, he was burning with fever. She ran. She fetched herbs, called the village healer, wet himself with cold cloths, prayed until her voice faded, but nothing worked. And when the sun rose the next day, her son didn't wake. He just lay there, motionless, pale, his lips slightly blue and his eyes closed forever. She didn't scream right away. She just stared, as if her brain refused to process it, as if by not saying it out loud she could keep reality suspended. But the body doesn't lie, and when she finally touched his cold skin, the truth sank in like a blade. He was dead, and with him, everything died. The funeral was organized quickly, because in that heat bodies don't wait. They wrapped the boy in simple sheets, placed him inside a cheap wooden box, and set out in procession through the streets of Nain. The whole town showed up, not because they loved the boy, but because that's what you do. You show up, you mumble something vague about God's will, and then you forget. But she couldn't forget. She stood there, shuffling her feet, choking on her own tears, knowing that when that body was buried, so would she. Because what is a woman without a husband and children in this world? Nothing, less than nothing, a nuisance. And she knew that in the coming days, distant relatives would begin to murmur about what to do with her. Maybe they'd send her to work for food. Maybe they'd throw her out on the street. Maybe they'd simply ignore her until she was gone and she no longer had the strength to fight. The procession moved slowly, like an open wound that wouldn't heal. The sickening smell of myrrh mixed with sweat, dust, and despair. The mourners wept, but it was professional, mechanical, soulless weeping. No one truly felt it, except her. She felt everything. Every step was agony, every breath, a betrayal of her son who no longer breathed. And as she walked, something inside her had already given up. She had already accepted that this was the end, that there would be no miracle, that God, if he existed, didn't look at women like her, invisible, disposable, forgotten. But then something impossible happened. Someone blocked the path, someone who shouldn't have been there, someone whose gaze, for the first time in years, truly saw her. And in that instant, unbeknownst to her, everything was about to change. But the price of that change would be greater than anyone could have imagined. There was silence, not the usual silence with pauses between words, but the kind of silence that weighs heavily, that suffocates, that makes the air thick and difficult to breathe. Jesus stood before the coffin, his hand still outstretched on the rough wood, and for a moment that seemed to last centuries, nothing happened. The crowd watched, confused, unsure of what was happening. The disciples exchanged nervous glances. His mother, on her knees, could barely look up, but something in her sensed this was no ordinary moment, because inside Jesus, at that very second, a silent war was being waged. A battle no one could see, but everyone felt in the air, like electricity before a lightning strike. He knew. He knew things no human being would ever know. He knew the complete plan, the perfect sequence of events that would lead to humanity's redemption. Every miracle had a purpose. Every healing was a sign. Every word, a piece on the divine chessboard, all choreographed since before time began. And there, before that coffin, he knew that resurrecting that boy was not in the original script, not in that way, not at that moment. That miracle would be spontaneous, driven not by celestial strategy, but by the raw human pain of a mother he barely knew. And that changed everything, because it meant breaking protocol, deviating from the plan, acting not as God, but as man. And the question that burned within him, in that split second that seemed eternal, was simple and terrifying. Did he have the right to do this? Consider the weight of this choice. Jesus carried within him the awareness of the past, the present, and the future. He knew that every act of compassion brought him closer to the cross, that every unscripted miracle would accelerate the wrath of the religious, intensify the persecution, shorten the time until crucifixion. Saving that young man meant, in a way, dying a little sooner. It meant adding another drop to the bitter cup he would have to drink, and yet there he was, before that broken mother, feeling her pain as if it were his own, tempted, not by pride, not by vanity, but by compassion, by the inability to watch that injustice and simply move on. And this, you must understand, is the most dangerous temptation there is, because it doesn't feel wrong, it feels right, it feels just, it feels like love. And maybe it is, but is it the right love, at the right time, in the right way? The disciples didn't understand why he was taking so long. Peter, impatient as ever, almost opened his mouth to say something, but something in Jesus' face silenced him. There was tension there, an internal struggle that manifested itself in the clenched jaw, the intense glow in his eyes, the way his fingers pressed against the wood of the coffin. It was as if two opposing forces were pulling Jesus in different directions. On one side, the eternal, perfect, unchanging plan. On the other, his human heart, bleeding for that woman's pain. And in that moment, he had to choose. Not calmly, not with time for reflection, but there, in that second that stretched like an elastic band about to snap. He could have moved on. He could have said something compassionate, touched his mother's shoulder, murmured condolences and kept walking, kept the plan intact, preserved the perfect sequence. But then he looked into her eyes and saw. He saw all the loneliness, all the injustice, all the despair accumulated from years of abandonment. And something inside him broke. It wasn't a rational decision. It was visceral. It was the moment his humanity screamed louder than his divinity. The moment unconditional love refused to follow. Rules, even divine ones. And there, in that silence that was now beginning to dissolve, Jesus made the most dangerous decision of all. He chose to feel. He chose to give in. He chose to break his own plan for just one person. And as he opened his mouth to speak the words that would bring that boy back, a part of him knew there would be consequences, that the Pharisees would hear about it, that his fame would spread even faster, that the cross would come even closer. But in that moment, looking at that mother, he didn't care, because sometimes true love doesn't calculate. You don't plan, you just act, even if it means suffering later, even if it means paying a steep price. And the price, though no one knew it yet, was already being calculated somewhere beyond time. Jesus' hand touched the wood, and in that instant everything changed, not subtly, not gradually, but like when lightning strikes the sky and illuminates everything for a blinding second, because touching a coffin wasn't just against the rules. It was ritual defilement. It was absolute impurity. Any rabbi would do the opposite, take 3 steps back, cover his face, murmur prayers of purification. But Jesus stepped forward. He placed his palm on that rough surface, stained with dirt and the pallbearer's sweat, and felt the chill of death creep up his fingers. The men holding the coffin froze, not out of respect, out of shock, out of not knowing what to do when someone breaks sacred protocol so blatantly, so publicly, so impossible to ignore. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It was no longer anticipation, it was disbelief. The entire crowd held its breath, and you could hear the warm wind rustling through the clothes, the creak of the wood in the bearer's hands, the irregular beating of the mother's heart as she now stared fixedly at this strange man. She didn't know who he was. She hadn't heard of the miracles, the healings, the stories that spread through the villages. To her, he was simply someone who had inexplicably interrupted the worst day of her life, and now he was there, touching her son's coffin, as if he had every right to do so, as if death were just another obstacle that could be removed with a gesture. And then Jesus spoke. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. His voice cut through the air like a sharp blade through fabric, firm, clear, without hesitation. "Young man, I say to you, arise." 4 words, just 4, but each one carried a weight that made the universe tremble, because he wasn't asking permission, he wasn't pleading with the heavens, he was ordering, commanding death to retreat, speaking to a corpse as if waking someone from a deep sleep. And the audacity of it, the sheer audacity of looking death in the eye and saying no, left everyone paralyzed. Some laughed nervously, unsure how to react. Others frowned, hoping this was some kind of parable, some metaphor, some teaching they didn't yet understand. But Jesus wasn't teaching, he was acting. Her mother couldn't breathe. Literally, she'd forgotten how, because something in that voice, something in the way the man spoke the words, made the impossible seem possible for a split second. And in that second, she allowed herself to believe, even though she knew it was madness, even though she knew the dead don't come back, that life doesn't work that way, that God doesn't rewrite endings. But there was something about that man, something inexplicable, something that transformed the air around him into pure power, into raw possibility. And when the silence stretched on for another second, 2 more, 3 more, and nothing happened, she felt hope begin to crumble in her chest, until she heard it, a sound, low, hoarse, like someone coughing after being underwater for too long. The boy moved, inside the coffin, and the world stopped, literally stopped. The wind died, the birds fell silent, people froze in place, eyes wide, mouths open, minds trying to process what they had just seen, because it wasn't possible, it couldn't be possible, but it was happening. The young man groaned, confused, disoriented, and his hands moved slowly toward his face, like someone waking from a very real nightmare. He blinked, once, twice, and then, with agonizing slowness, he began to sit up, slowly, as if his body still remembered the rigidity of death and needed to relearn how to move. And when he finally opened his eyes fully and looked around, seeing the terrified faces, the shocked mother, the unknown man with his hand still on the coffin, he asked, his voice weak and trembling, What happened?" No one answered, because no one knew. The mother stood motionless, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming uncontrollably, but she couldn't move. It was as if her brain had shut down, trying to reconcile what she saw with what she knew to be true. And Jesus, his hand still on the wood, looked at her, just looked. And in that look was something that went beyond compassion. There was recognition, as if he was saying without words, "I know what I just did. I know what this will cost. And yet, I did it." Because that miracle wasn't planned. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't part of the meticulously designed plan to save humanity. It was spontaneous. It was chaotic. It was pure, reckless, dangerous love. The kind of love that doesn't ask about tomorrow. Leave a comment below. If you were in that mother's shoes, would you be able to believe in the impossible even when everything seemed lost? The boy blinked again, and this time managed to keep his eyes open. The sunlight hit him directly in the face, too strong, too cruel for someone who had just emerged from absolute darkness. He instinctively raised his hand to shield his eyes, and that simple gesture, so human, so alive, was like a punch in the gut to everyone watching. Because dead hands don't move, lifeless bodies don't react. And there he was, blinking, breathing, confused like someone who wakes up in a strange place and can't remember how they got there. He looked around, saw the pallbearers backing away, terrified, their hands still trembling from holding the coffin that now seemed to weigh tons. He saw the crowd, faces frozen in expressions that mixed terror and fascination. And then, finally, his eyes found his mother. She couldn't hold it back. She let out a scream, but it wasn't the scream of despair that had echoed minutes before. It was something else, something that had no name in any language. It was shock mixed with relief, disbelief pierced by a hope so violent it hurt. She tripped over her own feet trying to run, almost fell to her knees, but someone caught her at the last second. And then she was there before the coffin, looking at her son who had been cold, rigid, dead just moments before, and now he was alive, breathing, looking at her with those confused, frightened, yet unmistakably alive eyes. She reached out, slowly, as if afraid he was an illusion, a final cruelty of her mind collapsing. But when her fingers touched his face, feeling the warmth of his skin, the dampness of his sweat, the real texture of flesh and bone, something inside her exploded. She pulled him out of the coffin with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The boy, still weak, still disoriented, almost fell, but she held him. She hugged him, as if she wanted to fuse him back into her own body, as if she could undo the last few terrible days, and erase the memory of death, and she wept. She wept so hard that her entire body shook, racked by sobs that came from a place so deep they seemed endless. But these were different tears. They were tears of something she never thought she would feel again. Joy, pure, absurd, impossible joy. And the boy slowly began to understand. He had died. Somehow, in some way his mind couldn't yet process. He had died, and now he was back. And the woman holding him, weeping uncontrollably, was his mother. And she was whole, alive, waiting for him. Jesus watched in silence. There was no triumph on his face, no satisfaction, only a deep, almost sad stillness, as if he were seeing something the others couldn't, as if he knew that that moment of pure joy, that desperate embrace, had a price yet to be paid. He stepped forward, lightly touched his mother's shoulder, and when she finally managed to raise her eyes, still wet with tears, he said softly, almost in a whisper, "He's yours. Take care of him." And in those simple words there was enormous weight, because Jesus wasn't just giving her son back, he was giving her life back, her future, her reason for continuing to exist. He was righting a cosmic injustice, rewriting an ending that seemed definitive, and the mother, speechless, unable to articulate anything beyond broken sobs, simply nodded and held her son even tighter. The crowd, until then paralyzed, began to move, slowly at first. Quiet, incredulous murmurs, then louder. Someone shouted, "It's a prophet." Another yelled, "God has visited his people." Mass hysteria began to take hold, people kneeling, others running to warn those who weren't there, others simply weeping without knowing why. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't just a miracle. It was death being publicly humiliated. It was the impossible happening in broad daylight, in front of dozens of witnesses. It was living proof that the rules of the universe could be broken. And that changed everything. Because if a man could bring back the dead simply by commanding, what else could he do? What other limits could he push? What other impossibilities could he make a reality? But as the crowd erupted in jubilation and panic, Jesus was already walking away, quiet, discreet, as if he wanted to disappear before the commotion grew too great. The disciples followed him, still stunned, exchanging glances that said everything and nothing at once. They had seen miracles before, but never like this, never so spontaneous, never so charged with something that seemed almost dangerous. And as they walked, Peter looked back one last time and saw the mother still holding her son, both crying, both trembling, both alive. And something inside him realized, even if he couldn't put it into words, that this miracle had changed something in Jesus himself, that something had been broken there, or perhaps mended. He couldn't say, but he knew nothing would be the same after that day. Leave a comment below. Do you believe there are times when love needs to break all the rules, even knowing there will be consequences? The The news spread like wildfire. Even before the sun began to sink below the horizon, all of Nain knew, and not just Nain. Travelers passing along the road heard the screams, saw the commotion and carried the story to neighboring villages. Merchants stopped selling to tell their customers. Children ran through the streets screaming that a dead man had come back to life. And with each repetition, the story gained layers, details, and interpretations. Some said Jesus had bargained with God. Others swore he had forced the boy's soul back into his body. There were those who whispered, fear in their voices, that this was not the work of God, but something darker, more dangerous, because bringing back the dead was unnatural. It was not right. It was a violation of the order of things. Among those who witnessed it up close, the reaction was even more visceral. Some fell to their knees the very moment the boy sat in the coffin and remained there prostrate in the dust, murmuring uncoordinated prayers, asking forgiveness for sins they didn't even know they'd committed, because being in the presence of something like that, of someone who could command their own death, was terrifying. It was like standing so close to a lightning bolt. You feel the electricity in the air. You know it could be disintegrated at any moment, but you can't look away. Others reacted the opposite way. They fled. They literally turned tail and ran, stumbling over each other, pushing past whoever was in front of them, desperate to put distance between themselves and this man who broke the most fundamental laws of existence. Because if he could do that, what else could? What would stop him from killing as easily as he resurrected? But most stayed, not out of courage, out of paralysis, out of an inability to process what they had seen. They stood there, looking alternately at Jesus, who was already beginning to walk away, and at the boy who now stood leaning on his mother, still staggering but undeniably alive. And on each of their faces was the same expression, fear mixed with something close to adoration, because they had just witnessed the impossible. Not a story, not a legend passed down from generation to generation, but the impossible happening right in front of them, in the harsh light of day, without tricks, without illusions. And it broke something inside the human mind, because we build our lives on certainties. Gravity pulls downward, fire burns, and the dead don't come back. But there, that afternoon in Nain, one of those absolute certainties had been shattered. And if one could be shattered, what guarantee the others were real? A man in the crowd, a cloth merchant who had come only out of social obligation, felt his legs give out. He sat down right there on the dusty ground and began to laugh, not with joy. It was the nervous, almost hysterical laugh of someone on the verge of a mental breakdown, because he had seen it. He had seen it with his own eyes, and now he would have to live the rest of his life knowing that everything he thought he knew about the world was wrong. A woman beside him was crying silently, but she couldn't explain why. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't happiness. It was an emotion that had no name, a mixture of relief and terror, of hope and panic. Because if this man could do this, then there was hope for all the dead, for all the lost children, for all the funerals. But it also meant that death, the one certainty everyone shared, had lost its absolute power, and that was both liberating and terrifying. The Pharisees in the crowd, 3 of them, watched everything with a very different expression. There was no admiration in their eyes, there was calculation, concern, because they understood what others didn't. That miracle wasn't just impressive, it was dangerous, politically dangerous, religiously dangerous. Because if people began to believe Jesus had power over death, what would stop them from considering him equal to God? Or worse, superior to the religious leaders who spent their entire lives studying the scriptures, but had never, ever done anything remotely like that. One of them whispered to the others, "We need to warn Jerusalem," and the other 2 just nodded somberly, because they knew that miracle, impressive as it was, had just signed Jesus' death warrant. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Jesus continued walking, and the crowd parted, almost afraid to touch him. Some reached out their hands, not to reach him, but as if simply to feel the air he displaced as he passed. And he didn't look at anyone. He didn't speak. He just walked on, with that unsettling stillness of someone who has just done something irreversible and now must deal with the consequences. The disciples followed at a respectful distance, because something in the air around him seemed too dense, too charged to penetrate, and as they left Nain behind, the murmur of the crowd grew, turning into a shout, a song, a hysteria. But Jesus didn't look back once, because he knew something no one else did at that moment. That miracle had changed everything. It had accelerated the clock, and now time was running out. Jerusalem was a day's walk from Nain, but the news came first. Travelers told it at stopping points. Caravans spread the rumor through the markets. And when it finally reached the ears of the high priests, the scribes, the elders who controlled the temple and laid down the law, the reaction was exactly what Jesus knew it would be. Silence. Not the silence of admiration, the silence of men plotting. They gathered in a closed room away from prying eyes and discussed it in low, controlled, dangerous voices. Because raising a dead man wasn't just a miracle, it was a declaration of authority that rivaled their own. And men who spend their entire lives building empires on ritual and tradition don't tolerate rivals, especially rivals who make the impossible seem easy. One of them, Caiaphas, slammed his hand on the table, not in anger, with determination. He must be stopped. The words fell heavily in the stuffy air of the room. No one disagreed, because everyone understood what was at stake. It wasn't about faith. It wasn't about God. It was about control. If Jesus continued performing miracles of that caliber, the people would begin to follow him. And if the people followed him, the Romans would notice. And if the Romans sensed a mobilization, they would crush everyone. Temple, priests, nation, everything would be destroyed. That's what they told each other. It was the justification they built. But deep down, their fear was more primitive. It was the fear of being irrelevant, of being exposed as ordinary men vested with divine authority, because none of them had ever brought back a dead person. And now, there was someone who could, someone who hadn't even studied in their schools. Jesus knew this. As he walked the dusty road away from Nain, he knew that every step he took toward compassion was also a step toward the cross. He wasn't naive. He wasn't idealistic. He understood perfectly the mechanics of power, the fragility of the human ego, the way small men react when confronted with something greater than themselves. And yet, he had done it. He had looked at that broken mother and chosen to save her, even knowing it would hasten the end, because there was something inside him, something perhaps even he couldn't fully name, that couldn't stand by and watch injustice without acting, even if it cost everything, even if it shortened the time he had left. The disciples walked in silence beside him. Peter wanted to talk, ask a question, try to understand what had happened that strange and intense afternoon, but every time he looked at Jesus' face, the words died in his throat, because there was something different about him, a gravity that hadn't been there before, as if he had crossed an invisible line and was now carrying a new, additional weight that only he could feel. John, more sensitive than the others, noticed it too. He realized that Jesus wasn't happy with the miracle. He wasn't proud. He was almost sad, as if he had just done something necessary, but irreversible, as if he had sacrificed something important, something that could not be recovered. And when John finally summoned the courage to ask, "Master, what happened there?" Jesus simply looked at him with those deep, weary eyes and said, "Love has a price. It always does." That night, camped under the stars, far from any city, Jesus lay awake long after everyone else had fallen asleep. He looked up at the sky, at the constellations he himself had created in times no one remembered, and felt the weight of what was to come. Each act of mercy was a stone added to the pile that would one day crush him. Each life saved was another nail being hammered into the cross. He had known this from the beginning, but knowing intellectually is different from feeling viscerally. And now, after Nain, after looking into that mother's eyes and feeling her pain as if it were his own, he felt it. He felt that time was running out, that the forces against him were gathering, that small men with great fear were plotting his death at that very moment. But the question that tormented him wasn't whether they would succeed in killing him. He knew they would. The question was another, deeper, more disturbing. Was it worth it? Saving a boy? Returning a son to his mother? Righting a tiny injustice in a universe full of injustices? Was it worth the price of hastening his own sacrifice? And as he gazed at the stars, searching for an answer that wouldn't come, he thought of Naim's mother. He thought of her embrace, her tears, the way she held her son, as if she could protect him from death forever. And in that moment he knew they would, that every life saved was worth the price, that every tear wiped away justified future suffering, because if love doesn't act when it's needed, it ceases to be love. It becomes just theory, and theories don't save anyone. Leave a comment below. Do you think it's worth sacrificing your own future to save someone in the present, even knowing there will be irreversible consequences? Naeem's mother woke up the next day and for a moment thought she'd dreamed it. All the funeral, the despair, the strange man, the miracle. But then she heard her son breathing in the next room, that deep, regular breath of someone alive, and relief flooded her again. She got up slowly, her body still aching from crying, and went to where he slept. She stayed there, just watching his chest rise and fall, as if needing confirmation with every second that this was real, that he was alive, that the nightmare was over. And as she watched, a fragile smile formed on her lips. For the first time in years, she felt something close to peace, because her son was back, and she had a second chance, a chance she never would have imagined possible. She would never know the truth. She would never know that the man who saved her son had, at that very moment, signed his own death warrant, that in Jerusalem, powerful men were discussing how to eliminate him, that each witness to that miracle was another piece in the process that would eventually condemn him. She would never know that the price of that resurrection would be paid in blood. Not her blood, not her son's blood, but the blood of the man who couldn't ignore her cries. And perhaps it would be better that way, because if she knew, how would she live? How could she look at her son every day knowing that his life cost the life of another? How would she sleep at night knowing that her joy was built on the sacrifice of someone she barely knew? Jesus never returned to Nain, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew it would be cruel. It would be cruel to show up at that woman's door and see the gratitude in her eyes, knowing she would soon hear of his death. It would be cruel to let her thank him, embrace him, offer everything she had in return, when the only possible return was something she could never give. So he moved on to other towns, other miracles, other lives saved, and each one was another drop in the bitter cup he knew he would have to drink, but he wouldn't stop. He couldn't stop, because if he stopped, if he overcalculated, if he weighed every act of compassion against the future cost, he would become exactly like the Pharisees, cold, calculating, secure. And that kind of security kills the soul long before it kills the body. Months later, when news of the crucifixion reached Nain, the mother heard only vaguely. Someone in the marketplace mentioned a prophet who had been executed in Jerusalem, someone who performed miracles, someone who defied the authorities. She felt a tightness in her chest, a strange intuition, but pushed the thought away, because there were so many prophets at that time, so many men preaching, healing, promising salvation. It couldn't be the same man. It couldn't be the one who saved her son, because that would be too unjust, too cruel. A man who restored lives couldn't have his own taken so brutally. So she chose not to investigate. She chose not to ask. She chose to protect her own sanity by not connecting the dots that deep down she already knew were connected. But years later, when his son was a grown man, married with children of his own, he heard the full story. He heard about Jesus of Nazareth, about the miracles, about the crucifixion, about the resurrection. And when he heard about the miracle at Nain, about the widow whose son was brought back to life, he knew it was him, that the man who died on the cross was the same one who brought him back. And the weight of that revelation nearly crushed him, because how do you live knowing someone died so that you could live? How do you wake up every day knowing your existence cost another's life? He never told his mother. He let her live the rest of her days believing the miracle was free, that it was a free gift from heaven. Because some truths are too heavy to carry. The irony was brutal, almost obscene. A mother celebrating her son's life, unaware that another son, another mother's son, would die precisely because she chose to save hers. Because Mary, Jesus' mother, also lost her son. She also wept. She also stood beside a destroyed body. But no one stopped her procession. No one touched the body and ordered it to be returned. She had to watch it all. The agony, the humiliation, the slow public death. And when they finally took him down from the cross and placed him in her arms, she held that cold, bloody, disfigured body and felt what the widow of Nain almost felt. The absolute pain, the irreparable loss. But unlike the widow, Mary didn't experience an instant miracle. She had to wait 3 days. 3 days that felt like 3 centuries. 3 days of emptiness, of silence, of doubt. And even when he returned, even when the resurrection happened, the scar remained. Because some pains are not erased, only transformed. Everyone knows the story of the temptation in the desert, 40 days without food or drink, the devil offering kingdoms, power, glory, obvious temptations, gross, easy to identify and reject. But no one talks about the other temptation, the worst of them all, the one that happened that afternoon in Nain before a coffin and a weeping mother. Because the devil is clever, he's learned that there's no point in offering evil disguised as evil. It's too easy to say no. True temptation comes disguised as kindness. It comes wrapped in compassion. It comes whispering in your ear, do good, save this person. What's the problem? It's love, isn't it? And that's precisely why it's so dangerous. Because it doesn't feel wrong, it feels right. It even feels divine. Jesus knew the plan, he wasn't improvising. Every miracle, every teaching, every step had a purpose within a larger sequence. The goal wasn't to save 1 or 2 or 10, it was to save everyone. And to save everyone, he needed to arrive at the cross at the right time, in the right way, after having done exactly what needed to be done. No more, no less. Every variable mattered. Every decision carried eternal weight. And there, before that widow, he was confronted with a choice that wasn't in the script. Saving that young man wasn't part of the original plan. It was a detour, an improvisation, an act driven not by divine strategy, but by human emotion. And that made everything infinitely more complicated, because it meant choosing between the perfect plan and the imperfect person who was suffering right in front of him. Temptation whispered, "You can save this boy. You have the power. Why hesitate? Isn't that what love does? Isn't that what God would do?" And Jesus, for the first time since the desert, felt the crushing weight of doubt, because the argument was valid. Love acts. Love doesn't calculate. Love doesn't say, wait, this isn't on the schedule. Love sees the pain and responds immediately, without thinking of the consequences. And there he was, tempted to love outside the plan, to be human before being God, to give in to compassion, even knowing it could compromise everything. And the question, burning inside him, wasn't, can I do this? It was, should I do this? Because he had the power. The question was whether he should use that power at that moment, in that way, for that specific person. Imagine the dilemma. If he saved the boy, he would hasten his own death. The Pharisees would hear. They would rage. The hunt would intensify. The time until the cross would shrink. And if he died prematurely, before he had taught everything he needed to teach, before he had adequately prepared, his disciples, the entire plan could fall apart. Millions of lives could be lost because he chose to save one. It was pure utilitarianism, cold logic, one for many, and it made sense. Strategically, it made perfect sense. Leave the boy dead, comfort the mother, move on, stay focused on the greater goal. But then he looked into her eyes, and all logic evaporated, because it wasn't about numbers, it wasn't about strategy. It was about that specific woman, in that specific moment, feeling that specific pain. And love, true love, cannot stand still in the face of that. But here's the point no one realizes. Jesus wasn't tempted to do evil. He was tempted to do good at the wrong time. And that's the most sophisticated trap there is. Because obvious evil is easy to reject. You see it from afar, you recognize it, you turn away. But good out of time? That's almost impossible to resist. Because every fiber of your being is screaming, do something. Every instinct is telling you, this person needs you now. And resisting that, choosing not to act even when you could, feels cruel, it feels wrong, it even feels sinful. But sometimes the deepest love is the one that waits, that trusts the process, that resists the temptation to fix everything immediately, because it understands that some things need to be fixed in the right order, at the right time, in the right way. Jesus could have resisted. He could have turned his back, said, it's not the time, let the widow bury her son. He could have kept the plan intact, and no one could blame him, because the plan was to save all of humanity, not just one person. But he didn't resist. And here's the most disturbing part. Maybe he messed up. Maybe that miracle was a mistake, a deviation from the script that cost time, that hastened death, that complicated everything. Or perhaps, and this possibility is even more disturbing, perhaps the plan itself included this deviation. Perhaps God, in becoming human, knew he couldn't resist that mother's cry. Perhaps the temptation wasn't a bug. Perhaps it was an essential part of the program, because a God who is never tempted by compassion, who never deviates from the plan for the sake of one person, is not a God who truly understands what it is to be human. And if he doesn't understand, how can he save? Tell us in the comments. Do you believe it's possible to do the right thing at the wrong time? Or does true love always act regardless of timing? What if he had moved on? What if, that afternoon in Nain, Jesus had heard that mother's cry and simply kept walking? Not out of cruelty, not out of indifference, but because the plan demanded it. Because saving all of humanity sometimes meant not saving someone specific. What if he had made that choice? The boy would have been buried, the mother would have returned to an empty house, and in the following days, weeks, months, she would have wasted away. Not physically, perhaps, but internally. That kind of slow death that happens when you lose the only reason to wake up in the morning. She would have become a ghost, breathing but not living, taking up space but not existing. And eventually, perhaps years later, someone would find her, alone, forgotten, dead for days without anyone noticing, because that's how invisible women disappear, silently. But the plan would have remained intact. Jesus would have reached the cross at the right time. The Pharisees would no longer have had that ammunition, that explosive story of a man raising the dead in broad daylight. The persecution would have been less intense. The time until the crucifixion would have been a little longer. Perhaps he would have been able to teach more, better prepare the disciples, consolidate the message. Perhaps the early church would have been stronger, more cohesive, better prepared for what would come next. Or perhaps not. Perhaps none of that would have mattered. Because here's the question no one wants to ask. Is a God who ignores a mother's cries in the name of a greater plan still worthy of being followed? Is a love that calculates, that weighs, that strategically chooses when to act and when not to act still love? Or is it just project management? Think about it. We are taught to trust God's plan, to believe He knows what He's doing, that every pain has a purpose, that every loss is part of something greater. And perhaps that's true. But what if God Himself can't follow His own plan when faced with real pain? What if, upon becoming human, He discovered that compassion can't be programmed, that true love is always a detour, an improvisation, a break from the script? Because it's easy to have a perfect plan when you're outside of time, observing from afar, seeing everything from an eternal perspective. But when you're there in the dust, listening to the cries, feeling the pain as if it were your own, the plan suddenly seems cold, distant, almost cruel. Jesus could have been the perfect God, the God who never deviates, who never hesitates, who executes His plan with surgical precision without letting emotions get in the way. But He chose to be the imperfect God, the God who weeps, who is moved, who breaks His own rules because He can't bear to see anyone suffering. And perhaps that's precisely what makes Him worthy of worship. Not perfection, but compassionate imperfection, not adherence to the plan, but the courage to abandon it when necessary, because a God who is never tempted to change His mind is not a God who truly loves. He's just a program executing code, efficient, predictable, dead. But here lies the void, the unanswered question. If Jesus did right in saving that boy, then God's plan was flawed from the start, because it needed to be corrected, adjusted, improvised. And if God needs to improvise, He isn't omniscient. He doesn't know all the variables. He doesn't have everything under control. But if Jesus did wrong in saving the boy, if that was truly an unauthorized deviation, then He sinned. And if He sinned, He can't be the perfect Savior. He can't be the spotless Lamb. The whole theology crumbles. So what is it? Was it right or wrong? Was it part of the plan, or was it a breach? And the answer, the honest answer, is that no one knows. Not the theologians, not the philosophers, not you, not me. Maybe not even Jesus Himself knew at that moment. Maybe He acted in the dark, trusting instinct, betting that love always chooses to save, even when it shouldn't. And perhaps that's exactly what makes this whole story so devastatingly human. Because we live like this too, making choices without knowing if they're right, loving people even when it's inconvenient, helping when we should be focusing on ourselves, deviating from the plan because we find someone crying along the way, and then we lie awake at night wondering, did I do the right thing? Should I have moved on? Was it worth it? And the answer never comes, only silence, and the hope, fragile but persistent, that choosing love even when it seems wrong can never be completely wrong. Because if even God hesitated before a crying mother, perhaps hesitating is the most divine thing we can do. Maybe doubt is proof that we are truly alive, truly feeling, truly loving. And maybe in the end, that's all that matters. If you were God for a day, would you follow the perfect plan? Or would you deviate from it to save one person who is suffering in front of you? And now you know the full story. The story, no one tells. The miracle that cost everything, the cry that changed destiny, the most dangerous temptation of all, being tempted not by evil, but by love. Jesus looked into that mother's eyes and chose to feel. You chose to break the plan. You chose to pay the price, and maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what makes you worthy of being followed. Not because I had all the answers, but because faced with one person's pain, he couldn't pretend not to see. The question remains, what about you? When you encounter someone suffering, will you follow the plan, the agenda, the priorities, whatever is most convenient? Or will you stop, touch the casket, risk everything, and say, rise? Because in the end, perhaps we will be judged not by how much we follow the script, but by how much we allow ourselves to be interrupted by those in need. And if it costs something, if it changes everything, if it turns your life upside down, maybe that's exactly when you discover what truly matters. If this story touched you, if it made you question, if it left you with more questions than answers, leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell us, would you choose the perfect plan or the imperfect person? And if this video touched your heart in any way, click the like button now. This simple gesture helps this content reach more people who also need to hear this story, people who are fighting their own battles between reason and compassion. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell, because there's much more to come. Stories that dig deep, that aren't afraid to ask the hard questions, that will make you think, feel, and question everything you thought you knew. Share this video with someone who needs this message today, because stories like this aren't meant to be kept. They're meant to be contagious, to disturb, to remind you that being human ultimately is choosing to love, even when it doesn't make sense. See you in the next video, and until then, don't forget, true love always costs something. The question is whether you're willing to pay the price.